The fog came early that morning, wrapping St. Mary Mead in a quiet not unlike morning. It pressed against window panes and curled beneath hedgerows, turning every garden path into a half-remembered dream. Miss Jane Marple, sitting by her parlor fire, with her knitting untouched beside her, noticed the way silence had shifted. She always did. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from loneliness or distance. It was expectant, watchful. She rose to check her dahlias just after dawn, more out of habit than need, and there, resting on the slats of her garden bench beneath the lilac tree, was a letter. Not posted, no stamp, no handwriting, only the faintest scent of clove and tobacco lingering on the parchment, folded once and bound with a length of worn twine. She paused before opening it, her fingers lingering on the wax seal, the shape of a weeping willow, pressed deep and clean. Something stirred inside her. Not recognition, not quite, but something close. The seal was old, and it bore the mark of someone who remembered how to make things by hand. Inside, there were no words, only a single line, printed faintly in a hand too restrained to be careless. "There's something at the bottom of the well." That was all. Miss Marple stood in the morning stillness for a moment longer. She didn't need a signature. Some messages don't come from names. Some come from the part of the past that memory avoids, the quiet corners we polish, but never clean. She had not thought of Lower Keld in more than 20 years. A village too far for errands, too near for forgetting. Cold soil, lean trees, a girl named Annis Brant who wore her father's boots and rarely smiled straight. Miss Marple went inside, placed the letter in her writing desk, and boiled water for tea. She knew she would be going, not because she was asked, but because she was expected. And in places like Lower Keld, expectations were often the beginning of everything. Coldstone House had never looked awake, not even in summer. Built of pale stone and crouched at the edge of Lower Keld's oldest orchard, it had the uneasy stillness of places where too much had happened and too little had healed. Even the ivy seemed hesitant, curling not upward but away, as though wary of what slept beneath the walls. Miss Marple arrived on a Wednesday. The hired car dropped her just beyond the rusted gate. No one greeted her at first. The silence of the house was not just quiet, it was calculated. After a moment, a man appeared on the path, plain coat, worn boots, a face that had forgotten how to smile. He lifted her bag with a quiet grunt and said nothing. Inside, the entry smelled of lavender and something less kind, like paper turned to dust and memories sealed too long. In the parlor, the fire was low but alive. Miss Marple was met by a woman in her early 60s, hands red from cold water, eyes like glass with something trapped beneath. "You're Miss Marple," the woman said softly. "She always said someone would come, even if she never told me who." "You are Mrs. Wise," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "I was her housekeeper for 28 years. She looked down briefly, then back up. "Annis sent for you," though she didn't know she did. Miss Marple nodded, and something unspoken passed between them. Grief is sometimes clearest when it's out of order, when it follows instead of precedes. "When did she die?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Wise looked toward the back of the house, where the orchard began. "4 weeks ago. They say she slipped into the well." "She never slipped in her life," she added after a pause. Miss Marple sat down slowly, her coat still on. The room was tidy, obsessively so, as though someone had cleaned not for comfort but to erase. "They found her in the morning," Mrs. Wise continued, upright, as if seated, eyes open. "No sign of struggle, no letter, no reason. And yet you wrote to me." The housekeeper looked startled. "I didn't." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "But someone left the letter." Mrs. Wise shook her head. "Annis had no friends. No kin left. Just me. And the house." There was a pause. "I should tell you," Mrs. Wise said, lowering her voice. "There's a room she never let me clean. 2nd floor. 3rd door on the right. She locked it when Elsie went missing." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened just slightly. "Elsie." Mrs. Wise hesitated, as though speaking the name allowed something back into the house. "Her sister. Gone 30 years now. The river, they said. But no one ever found her. And Annis, she was never the same. She waited, not in a way you could see, but in the way a woman keeps one plate too many on the shelf, just in case. Miss Marple stood and walked to the hearth. Above it hung a faded oil painting of two girls. One had eyes too direct for a child. The other stood slightly behind, holding a blue ribbon, smiling like she didn't quite mean it. The fire popped once. Then the room fell still again. The orchard behind Coldstone House was not beautiful in any traditional sense. It had once been cared for, rows of pear and crooked apple trees, a trellis where roses used to grow, but now the land felt like it had deliberately let itself go. The trees leaned inward, the path was uneven, and the silence carried not peace, but something else, something that listened. Wrapped in her shawl, Miss Marple moved carefully along the frostbitten earth. Her eyes were not just searching the surroundings, but remembering them. The well stood just as she had expected it to, at the far end, hidden among the ivy and half-choked by moss. Its stone cap was weathered, the rope frayed and limp. It was no longer in use. No bucket, no pulley, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt quiet in the way an old wound does. She ran her fingers gently across the rim and paused. There was a fresh scrape along one side of the stone, thin but clear. Something heavy had been dragged across it recently. That detail didn't fit with the official story. "You shouldn't be out here alone," said a voice behind her. She turned. A boy, no more than 20, with sandy hair and a jacket a little too big for his frame, stood there holding a bundle of kindling. His tone wasn't rude, just cautious. "I'm Milo," he added. "I tend the grounds. What's left of them?" "Miss Marple," she replied softly. He gave a single nod, his eyes flicking toward the well. "She said someone would come," he murmured. "Didn't say your name. Just that someone would know what to look for." Miss Marple glanced back toward the well. "She said this before she died. About a week before. Maybe less." He shifted his weight, tightening the twine around his sticks. "She was different, Miss Brant. Always quiet, but not in a peaceful way. Like something was always pressing down. She used to walk this orchard every morning, didn't she? Even in the rain," he said. "Every day. She always stopped here, by the well. Just stood there, like she was listening for something, or waiting for it to speak." Miss Marple kept her voice gentle. "Did she ever speak about her sister?" He froze. "Elsie, you knew. I wasn't supposed to, but I found a photo once. In the old greenhouse. 3 girls standing by this well. One of them had a blue ribbon in her hair. The other 2 were her." "You're sure?" "Positive." He looked uncomfortable now. "I showed it to Mrs. Wise. She took it from me straight away. Said it was a misprint and told me to forget it." "Did the photo have names written on it?" "No," his voice dropped. "But the one with the ribbon, she looked like she wanted to speak. The others just stood still." The wind moved faintly through the branches above them. Miss Marple looked down at the well. It did not look evil, nor did it threaten. It simply waited. It looked, in that moment, like grief with nowhere left to go. She didn't speak of guilt or death yet. Those were words for later. For now, she thought only of memory, the kind that doesn't fade, but settles, quiet like dust on stone, waiting for someone who knows how to listen. The house did not sleep at night, not entirely. Though its lights were extinguished by 9, there were creaks that moved like footsteps across the upper floor, and once, just after midnight, Miss Marple thought she heard the soft hiss of a drawer being closed. Not slammed, not fumbled, just a quiet finality, the kind that accompanied decisions made after long hesitation. But she waited until morning to act, as was her way. After breakfast, she asked politely if she might be allowed to visit Annis Brant's bedroom. Mrs. Wise hesitated, but consented, though her mouth grew thinner and her voice more formal. "It hasn't been touched," she said. "Some people think it's respectful. Others say it's fear." She didn't clarify which one she belonged to. The room was pale, cold, and curiously hollow. Not empty, far from it. The bed was still made with military neatness, and the curtains, though drawn back, had not been opened wide enough to invite sunlight. The scent in the room was subtle, lavender, and something bitter beneath it. Old paper, perhaps, or loneliness. Miss Marple noticed immediately that the bookshelf held no fiction, only ledgers, notebooks, and an old birdwatching guide with pressed feathers flattened inside its pages. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph, its glass cracked in two neat lines across the center. It showed three girls standing side by side in the orchard. One was Annis, unmistakably younger, but bearing the same grave expression. The second girl was blonde, her curls bouncing even in stillness. And the third? Well, the third had been vandalized. Her face had been scratched out carefully, thoroughly, with a pen or blade. Nothing else in the photo had been touched, but that third girl had been erased. Miss Marple turned it over. No date, no names, just a corner peeled away, where someone had once tried to remove a label and failed. In the drawer beside the bed was another clue, a letter. Not sealed, not addressed, but folded and worn with rereading. It was unsigned and written in unsteady, urgent handwriting. It read, "She never forgave me for that summer, but I never stopped searching for her, even when they lied, even when they said she drowned." Miss Marple held it delicately, her fingers trembling just slightly, not with fear, but with recognition. There are truths that speak quietly, and this one had whispered through decades. That afternoon, over a modest pot of tea in the kitchen, she asked Mrs. Wise about the girl in the photo. The housekeeper flinched, her spoon clinking too hard against the cup. "That was Elsie," she said after a long pause. "Annis's sister, younger by 2 years. She vanished in the summer of 1907. "Vanished," Miss Marple echoed. "They said she wandered off. Some claimed the river took her. Her shawl was found near the edge, wet, but no body ever surfaced." Her voice lowered. Some whispered she ran away. Others thought she was taken, but no one ever dared suggest that something had happened here. And Annis, she stopped speaking. For nearly a year. Didn't weep, didn't rage, just folded in on herself. And when she returned, she was no longer the same person. Miss Marple nodded slowly, sipping her tea. Grief often changes its mask over time. What begins as loss can harden into ritual, into habits that look like order, but are simply a way to keep the past from collapsing. She asked to see the parish records, but Mrs. Wise hesitated. "There's something you should know," she said finally. "The day after Elsie vanished, Mr. Brant had the well kept. Said it was unsafe, but no one ever mentioned it had been open." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Then how did he know?" Mrs. Wise said nothing, and that, Miss Marple thought, was answer enough. The village of Lower Keld did not keep secrets well, at least not the kind that shouted, but it had long since perfected the art of quiet omission, the things not said at dinner, the glances exchanged in silence, the way a question could be answered with a change in subject. Miss Marple, having spent a lifetime decoding the language of silence, knew that sometimes truth was not hidden, only politely ignored, and it was in such careful forgetting that she often found the most enduring clues. Late that afternoon, wrapped in her shawl and with the breeze nipping softly at her cheeks, she made her way toward the churchyard. The headstones leaned into each other like conspirators, moss thick upon the older ones, names half erased by time and indifference. She was met there by the young vicar, Father Giles, a man more comfortable among hymns than histories. He welcomed her warmly, if distractedly, but tensed when she mentioned Elsie Brant. "She sang in the choir," he said quietly. "Sweet voice. We still use her solo in the harvest hymnal." But he looked at the stone path. "We don't speak of her much anymore. There was never a service. No body, you see. No closure. And yet she's remembered," Miss Marple said, her eyes drifting to the far corner of the yard where a hawthorn bush grew wild beside a bench. "Yes," the vicar replied, "by some, especially Annis." There was a pause. "She came here often, even in the rain," he added. "Once I found her sitting there just after dawn, soaked through. I asked if she was waiting for someone. She said, 'She's already here, just not where you think.'" He looked up then, eyes shadowed by the past. "I thought it was grief talking, but now I'm not sure." Miss Marple took a slow walk among the graves. At the very end, half concealed by the wild growth of ivy, she found it, a stone with no name, only the year 1907 and a carving of two clasped hands. Fresh petals lay at its base. Bluebells, blooming out of season. That evening, Miss Marple returned to Coldstone House and asked to see the study. The room had not changed. The fire was unlit, the curtains half-drawn. On the shelves behind the desk, she found the parish records, yellowed pages bound in cracked leather. She read in silence. One name appeared, then vanished. Elsie Brandt's baptism was recorded in 1896, but no death was ever listed. And more strangely still, in the register of burials, her name had been entered once in pencil, then erased so completely only a faint indentation remained. She traced the groove gently with her fingertip. Erased, not forgotten. Downstairs, she found Milo in the kitchen, polishing a brass candlestick. He was quiet at first, but her questions were not sharp. They were gentle, laced with the kind of warmth that encouraged remembrance. She used to say the well was cursed, he murmured, eyes fixed on the flickering candle. Said it remembered things, even when people didn't. Once, she made me promise never to go near it at night. I asked why, and she said, because memory can pull. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Did she ever tell you what happened to her sister? He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, she saw the fear, not of the well, not even of the truth, but of what it would mean to speak it aloud. She said she let go. He whispered, that's all. Not that she pushed, not that it was anger, just she let go, and then it was too late to pull her back. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that lives at the bottom of old water, where names fade slowly, but the weight of guilt remains. The morning broke slow and silver. The sky hung in stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Coldstone House was quieter than usual, the walls exhaling a stillness that made the floorboards creak louder and the fire's absence feel colder. Miss Marple sat at the window with her knitting untouched, her gaze resting on the orchard. Fog clung to the trees, and the well at the center seemed to pulse with something old and unfinished. She had seen many kinds of grief in her life, but the kind that wrapped itself in silence, that lived on in stone and bone and unfinished songs, always left the deepest scars. Later that morning, she made her way to the west wing of the house, abandoned now, unused since Annis's passing. The corridor was dim, dust coiling in the sunlight like smoke. At the end stood a door that refused to open until she leaned her full weight against it. Inside was a forgotten sitting room, its furniture covered in white cloths like ghosts at rest. But it was the writing desk that drew her attention. On top sat a ledger, brittle with age, with a page folded carefully like something sacred. She unfolded it. It was a confession, half letter, half mourning. Annis's handwriting, precise but unsteady, filled only half the page. She told me she would tell. Said the truth could live in the light. But I knew better. Truth makes people turn. It breaks what's already cracked. I begged her not to go, but her eyes were already facing the sky. And then she was gone, and I waited for the scream, but there wasn't one, just the sound of water taking her. Miss Marple read the words twice, then again, not because she doubted their meaning, but because she wanted to feel the weight of them properly. There was no admission of guilt, only the ache of having stood beside a choice that had not been made, but allowed, letting go, whether by fear or frailty. The result was the same. That evening, as the sky blushed faintly with the last of the autumn sun, Miss Marple sat across from Mrs. Wise, who had made a pot of tea too strong and cut the bread too thin. They sat in the kitchen, where warmth lingered longer than elsewhere in the house. She never spoke of Elsie. Mrs. Wise said at last, without prompting, not properly. Sometimes she'd hum a hymn. That was how I knew she was thinking of her. Blessed quietness. But never the words, just the melody. Said it was the last thing she heard her sing. Miss Marple nodded. Was there ever an inquest? Mrs. Wise shook her head. There was nothing to find. No one saw. And in a village like ours, if something isn't seen, it isn't spoken. They let the story go quiet. But the well remembered, Miss Marple said softly. The old woman looked at her. She used to say that too. In the quiet that followed, a kettle began to boil, the sound sharp in the stillness. But beneath it, Miss Marple could hear something else, the way silence folds around memory, preserving it, making it heavier with each passing year. She walked again that night, alone, guided only by the pale sliver of moon. The orchard was silver with frost, and the well stood still and silent as ever. She knelt beside it, one hand on the cold stone rim. "I'm here," she whispered. "I've heard what no one would speak, and I will remember what they chose to forget." Somewhere in the distance, a bird stirred, and from the trees, the faintest breeze passed, not cold, but watchful. Miss Marple did not move for a long time, because grief, when it lingers too long in silence, becomes something else entirely, something that waits in the water, and watches, and remembers. By morning, a thin film of frost had stretched itself across the windows of Coldstone House, blurring the view like an old memory trying to forget itself. Miss Marple stirred early, not from sleep but from thought, her mind returning again and again to the words Annis had left behind, to the silence that surrounded Elsie's name, and to the well, which had listened longer than anyone else had. The air held the weight of something inevitable, something that had waited decades to be found. After a quiet breakfast and a lukewarm cup of tea, Miss Marple returned to Annis's writing desk, this time looking not for what had been written, but for what had been removed. There, beneath the lining of the second drawer, she found what she had expected, a hidden envelope, unsealed but aged. Inside were 3 small, delicate drawings on church paper. They were childish, simple, but unmistakable. The first was of 2 girls beneath a tree, Annis and Elsie. The second was of a well, large and dark. The third, and final one, was of a hand reaching upward from water, fingers stretched alone. She brought the envelope to the fire and sat in silence. Mrs. Wise, upon seeing the sketches, turned away slightly, her lips trembling. "She used to say she dreamed of her," she whispered. "That Elsie never really left. That she still waited. I thought it was just grief." Miss Marple shook her head gently. It was guilt, and perhaps the promise left unkept. The rest of the day passed in slow currents. The fog had lifted slightly by afternoon, and Miss Marple asked Milo to accompany her one last time to the well. Together, they brought tools, a crowbar, rope, a lantern, and the careful resolve of those who already know what they will find. The slate cover groaned as it came free, revealing the mouth of the well, still and black. Milo lowered the lantern first. Its light swayed slightly, casting soft orange shadows against the stone. Then, at Miss Marple's signal, he descended. The rope held, and the silence deepened. Minutes passed. Then a soft voice echoed from below. "There's something here. A box. And bones. Small ones." They retrieved it gently, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with frayed twine. Inside was what remained, bones too delicate for time to have spared, a faded ribbon, and a lock of hair sealed in wax. At the bottom of the box was a note, near dissolved with moisture. Miss Marple read the words aloud to the empty orchard. "Forgive me. I didn't mean to let go." The constable arrived by dusk, a quiet man who took notes with care, but asked no unnecessary questions. It would go to the coroner now, of course, but there was little doubt as to who the remains belonged to. The case, though cold, would find its conclusion. A name would be spoken, a place of rest marked. Back inside, the mood at Coldstone shifted. Not lighter, not yet, but steadier. Mrs. Wise made fresh tea and opened the windows slightly. Even the house seemed to breathe again. That evening, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire, her shawl wrapped close, her eyes reflecting the flames. When Milo came in to thank her, she only nodded and offered him a single sentence. "You saw the truth before anyone else. You just didn't know how to name it." He sat for a moment, silent, then asked, "Do you think she's at peace now?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Instead, she stood and walked slowly to the window. Outside, the orchard trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches no longer braced against something buried, but softened by what had finally come to light. "I think," she said, "that the past stops knocking once it's let in." And for the first time in many years, Coldstone House slept without stirring. The following morning arrived with a light mist and the quiet insistence of change. Coldstone House, though still steeped in shadows, now seemed to inhale and exhale with something closer to stillness than sorrow. The well was no longer a secret. The silence around Elsie had broken, and yet, Miss Marple knew, every ending contains the bones of another beginning. She stood by the window, gazing out over the orchard. The trees, so long witnesses to grief, now trembled gently under the weight of a breeze rather than memory. A small bouquet of bluebells had been placed near the well's edge, wrapped in a faded ribbon. Milo's doing, she suspected. Or perhaps Mrs. Wise. Or maybe someone unseen, someone who had watched all along. Downstairs, the constable returned with a letter in hand, forwarded from the county office. The coroner's report. The remains were confirmed to be that of a child, female, aged roughly 9 to 11, with signs of healed injury, perhaps a fall. Nothing conclusive. No proof of malice. Only the kind of ambiguity time tends to protect. There will be no inquest, he said softly. Not formally. Miss Marple accepted the decision with a quiet nod. The law, she had long understood, was rarely in step with the heart. She had not come seeking punishment, only the truth, and a place for it to rest. Later that afternoon, as she and Mrs. Wise walked through the overgrown herb garden, the housekeeper spoke again of Annis. She never married, never left this place. Always said it wasn't the house that held her. It was the memory. She felt responsible for Elsie's death. Said she made her promise not to tell, and that promise cost her everything. Miss Marple gently touched a dry sprig of lavender. Grief, she said, is often mistaken for loyalty. But what Annis bore was something deeper, a binding made not with affection, but with silence. Mrs. Wise nodded, her eyes damp. She thought the well would keep her secret. But secrets aren't kept. They wait, and they grow. As dusk fell, a warmth entered the drawing room that hadn't touched it in decades. The fire crackled without tension, and the old portrait of Annis and Elsie, once hidden behind other paintings, was now placed gently on the mantel. Not a shrine, but a recognition, a whisper to the past. You are seen. In her room, Miss Marple packed her bag slowly. There was no rush, only a kind of settled quiet that comes when something broken has finally been named. Before she slept, she wrote a short letter to Elizabeth Grant in St. Mary Mead. My dear, there was water, yes, but there was also memory, and beneath that, truth. Coldstone held them all, tightly coiled. But even the deepest well cannot resist the sound of a child's name finally spoken. Yours, as always, Jane. And outside, beneath the tree where the well once stood, the earth began to soften, not from the rain, but from the long-awaited release of something too long buried. By morning, the frost had thinned to dew, and the orchard exhaled steam, like an animal rising slowly from sleep. Coldstone House stood a little straighter in the light, its shutters slightly open, its long corridors no longer echoing with memory alone. Miss Marple sat with her tea in the east room, watching the garden where the well had once stood, now filled, planted over with violets and forget-me-nots. Milo passed through with a gentle nod, his footsteps softer, as though the earth no longer carried the same weight. In the corner sat Mrs. Wise, darning a shawl Annis had once worn. For a time, there was no need for speech. Peace, when it finally enters a house, does so quietly. The constable had returned once more, not in uniform but in a gray coat, holding a thin envelope. It came from a solicitor's office in Exeter, he said, setting it on the table before Miss Marple. Apparently left in a private drawer, Annis Brandt's final letter. Never posted. Miss Marple opened it slowly, the paper crackling like autumn leaves. The letter was addressed not to a name, but simply to the one who knows. If you are reading this, then the house has finally spoken. I never meant to keep her secret, only to hold it until the pain was bearable. But it never was. Elsie slipped that summer, into fear, into silence, and I let her. I did not push her. I did not pull her. But I let go. That is the truth. And in letting go, I have held on to everything else ever since. It was signed with only her initials, A.B. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, then tucked it back into its envelope. Not a confession, she said softly. A reckoning. That evening, She and Mrs. Wise sat in the parlor one last time. The lamps cast warm shadows, and the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hall, unbothered at last. She tried her whole life to protect Elsie, Mrs. Wise murmured, but in doing so, she buried her twice. Miss Marple nodded. The dead never ask for protection, only remembrance. As the hour grew late, Miss Marple stood and looked around the room. The portrait on the mantel remained, a quiet promise to the past, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed. Beside it, a small ceramic bird rested on a lace doily, Annis's favorite, according to Mrs. Wise. A house remembers, Miss Marple said, gathering her shawl. But it also forgives, once someone dares to tell the truth out loud. In the morning, she would leave for St. Mary Mead. But tonight, she allowed herself one last moment in the house that had held too much for too long. She walked through its halls, her fingers grazing the old paneling, feeling not coldness, but calm. Outside, the orchard trees swayed not with sorrow, but with sleep. Miss Marple left Coldstone House just after sunrise. The mist had thinned to pale ribbons across the orchard, curling around the new patch of violets where the well had once gaped like an unspeaking mouth. The air was quieter now, not silent, but still, the kind of quiet that followed truth, not secrecy. She walked with her bag in hand and her shawl drawn close, her steps measured, her thoughts unfinished. The driver waited by the lane. Behind her, the house remained, not brighter, not younger, but somehow more honest. And in the upstairs window, Mrs. Wise stood like a figure from a painting, one hand raised in soft farewell, the other pressed against the glass. Not mourning, not quite. Something gentler, something closer to release. As the car rattled away down the lane, the village of Lower Kelt stirred back into its usual rhythm. Carts being drawn out, shutters opening with lazy hinges, voices beginning to call across stone walls. No one spoke of the well, but something had shifted. Not in words, perhaps, but in the way the wind moved through the trees. Less like a warning, more like a sigh. By the time Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead, the chrysanthemums had bloomed wide in her garden. Elizabeth Grant greeted her with tea already brewing and a fresh scone warming on the windowsill. "You were gone longer than usual," Elizabeth said gently. "There was more to listen to," Miss Marple replied, easing into her chair. "Not in speech, but in silence. And silence, as you know, is often the truest language of grief." She did not speak of Annis Brandt, or the broken photograph, or the blue bead missing from the bracelet beneath the floor. She simply watched the steam curl up from her cup and thought about how some stories don't end with answers, only with understanding. The pressed flower she had taken from the orchard, violet, delicate, sat now inside her journal, not as a souvenir, but as remembrance. The kind of remembrance that doesn't ask for recognition, only stillness. That evening, she sat alone in her parlor, knitting untouched in her lap, the fire humming soft behind the grate. The village clock chimed 8, its tone steady, unhurried. She let it finish before she spoke. "Some wells are not meant to hold water," she said aloud, though to no one, only memory. And she smiled, not with cheer, but with peace, because the truth had not punished. It had unburdened, and that, for a village long strangled by silence, was justice enough.